right, making it hard. And Nelson's got round the outside of it. Oh! Big slide from Nelson and nearly contact. Tremendous stuff. Real wheel-to-wheel stuff. Yes, and of course,
Motorsport, one of the most well-renowned and enjoyed forms of sporting around the world. Today, I'll be covering many different types of motorsport and the impact that the Cold War had on them in the short and the long term. First, Formula One, which is often considered the pinnacle of racing, really took off as an official sport during the beginning of the Cold War. Motorsports require a lot of money to get into, and therefore it spread faster in the wealthier, capitalist-aligned countries like Britain and France. The core values of motorsport are really much more capitalist-aligned. Teams with more money do better because they can get better connections, better parts, and better drivers. This contrasts with traditional communist ideology. Like we talked about in class, sports were highly regarded in the USSR, especially team sports, because they required teamwork and equality among all members in order for the team to do well. Motorsport is quite the opposite, and in some F1 races, the teammates are actually competing against each other as well as other drivers for a higher place. Formula One held its first race at the British Silverstone circuit in 1950 and continued to travel around Western Europe throughout most of the Cold War. However, the Eastern Bloc countries did have their very own Formula Racing series called Formula Easter. Sam Tomlinson from Grand Prix 247 says, "Formula Easter? Don't worry if you haven't heard of it. Few in the West have." Pause. This quote was written by Sam Tomlinson, a young writer for Grand Prix 247. He's written dozens of articles on Formula 1 and 2, both on historic topics and current ones. He's speaking from a modern point of view, where not many people are aware that Formula Easter ever existed. So his point about people, specifically in the West, not being familiar with the racing category definitely has some substance to it. This point also aligns with many other sources, or the lack thereof, because there's almost no information on the internet about Formula Easter. Formula Easter was an interesting form of racing because of the way that the cars were made. Since motorsports require so much money to get into, Formula Easter teams often found ways of decreasing costs in any way that they could. This includes taking parts from production cars, modifying them, or in some cases just sticking them on the race car. Some Formula Easter drivers switched to traditional Formula racing when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, which had good and bad effects on the motorsport community. The Formula Easter Championship was ironically called the Peace and Friendship Cup. Hungarian four-time Formula Easter Peace and Friendship Cup winner Csaba Kazsar switched to Formula 3 after the USSR collapsed. He then died in an F3 race in 1998. Along with drivers converting to traditional Formula racing, many Formula Easter cars were modified into Formula V or Formula Ford cars to continue their racing journey and keep team costs down. By the 1980s, as the Cold War was cooling down, both Eastern and Western Europe were looking at bringing international motorsports competition back into the East. The first Formula One race held behind the Iron Curtain was the Hungarian Grand Prix in 1986, which is often regarded as one of the greatest races in all of motorsports, with the main reason being the location. There was a lot of anticipation around the Hungarian Grand Prix, as it was a communist country. The clip at the very beginning of the video is from the 1986 Hungarian Grand Prix, where you can see the packed stands as race fans from all around the world watch what is often called the greatest overtake in racing history. Rally. The next form of motorsport I'll be covering is another very interesting one that takes place mostly on dirt and gravel backcountry roads, with normal street cars that have been tuned and modified into indestructible country road slaying monsters. During the Cold War, WRC, which is short for World Rally Championship, teams behind the Iron Curtain had to maximize costs to be as efficient as possible, just like the Formula Easter teams did. This resulted in drastic measures that had many WRC teams making their cars in the same way that the Formula Easter teams did, with spare parts. Even large teams like the Soviet Toyota Gazoo racing team had to cut costs. The difference between Formula Easter parts and WRC parts was that the spare parts on WRC cars often came from things like Soviet rockets because of their weight and extra strength that was needed in harsh rally race conditions. This is a clear and direct connection between rally racing and the Cold War through the space race. Another clear connection is the fact that there were supposedly many KGB agents at rally races that included teams from overseas or non-communist countries. The KGB was the Central Intelligence Agency for the Soviet Union, and they often appeared at certain Estonian WRC races for fear of non-communist teams gathering information on the Soviets and using it to gain a powerful military or political stance against the USSR. Speaking about overseas, occasionally at rally races that happened outside of the Eastern Bloc, when teams wanted to get rid of their competition, they would often tell government agents that their opponents were plotting to flee their communist country while they were abroad, and the government agents would make sure those drivers would not be competing. On the American side of things, the Corvette, one of the greatest and most influential sports cars ever, was born right in the height of the Cold War. Many early Corvette ads, like this one, directly connect the Corvette to the Cold War, taunting the Soviets with the U.S.'s superior sports cars. This ad says that the Corvette is a V8 engine that goes like a V2 guided missile, simultaneously calling their cars as fast as a rocket and giving the American people something to be proud of during a very tense time. Many sports cars like the Corvette were recommended for fighter pilots to drive because they were the closest thing to a road version of the jets that the pilots would be flying in war. Air Force generals even encouraged their fighter pilots to race the sports cars on base to keep their senses and reflexes sharp in event of a surprise attack. Carroll Shelby was another great American sports car manufacturer who made the legendary Shelby Cobra sports car. Shelby was a race car driver who then went on to create his own car, just like Heinz Melkes, a former race car driver who made the only state-approved sports car in Eastern Germany, the Melkes RS1000. The car market in Eastern Germany was quite hectic during the Cold War, with wait times for a new Trabant being as long as 18 years. This meant that race car teams that were not making their own chassis, like Formula Easter was, had to source cars in other ways so that they could have something to modify. This often included using Ladas, a Soviet car brand that was popular in the 70s, as shown in this picture. Now, this doesn't mean that Eastern Germany did not play a role in international racing. Germany had a hand in producing many racing series, like Formula 4 cars, Formula 3 cars, and cars for Formula Skoda. But those were all custom-made chassis that did not require a donor car, unlike WRC. Speedway is another form of motorsport on a motorcycle that was developed in the 1920s, where four bikes race side by side at speeds of over 60 miles per hour around a dirt track without brakes. Richard Mills from the Oxford Academic says, in 1964, a full Soviet team arrived on British shores for a test series against the best the Commonwealth had to offer. Racing internationals at Wembley, Coventry, and Manchester, and appearing at several other venues, these mysterious Soviet visitors received a warm welcome. The author, Richard Mills, is a university student in his 20s, so he would not have been alive for this event. This gives me a stronger feeling of reliability because he's going to be a knowledgeable and unbiased source of information. He mentions that when the Soviets arrived, they had a sort of mystery to them. This makes sense, given the context that the Soviet team was a brand new team and that the Soviets were well known around the world to have very good sports teams. Another quote from Richard Mills, the tense Cold War conflicts gave the motorcycle racing world much needed publicity, aligns with other sources like Winterthur's magazine Vintage Corvette ad that shows Chevrolet trying to profit off the Cold War conflict and use it to promote their cars. When given these two quotes and their context, we can start to piece together how the Cold War might have impacted speedway motorcycle racing by boosting attendance turnouts and bringing much of the life back to the sport that it had lost in the Second World War. When looking back at all this information, we can gain a pretty good start on answering the question, how did the Cold War impact motorsports as a whole? After looking at the Cold War's effect on Formula 1, Formula Easter, WRC, private motorsports, and speedway, we can gather that the Cold War caused many motorsport teams to change their view on their sports, take drastic measures to decrease cost, and take advantage of government policies. It also created some of the greatest moments in motorsport history, and brought huge attendance to those great moments due to excitement around Soviet sporting. Thank you very much for listening and watching my video.